And I'll bet you never thought you'd hear me preach on that passage. Now, about food sacrificed to idols, huh? I hope at least a few of you are scratching your heads and going, what? All this stuff about food sacrificed to idols doesn't connect well with our culture today. And if anyone took this passage as a mandate to be vegetarian because Paul declares that he will stop eating meat, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that isn't what this is about. There are good reasons to be vegetarian, your own health, eating low on the food chain, and so on, but this passage has nothing to do with that. Now, in truth, I didn't have to choose this bizarre passage. You know that those of us who are filling in while we wait for our new pastor are using the lectionary. But the lectionary gives 4 choices of biblical passages every week. Why then did I choose this strange passage? Well, first, because one of the things I love about Parkside is that we don't avoid difficult passages in the Bible. Second, because I think this passage does have something important to say to us, idols notwithstanding. And third, because it's a good example of why I never recommend to people that they just sit down and read the Bible cover to cover. Much of the Bible makes very little sense unless you know the social and historical context in which it was written. For understanding that context, one of my favorite books is William Countryman's Dirt, Greed, and Sex. Now, a little aside here, when I was working full-time, I spent a lot of time on airplanes and in airports, and in those days, people didn't have smartphones, and they didn't yell into their phones in the airport, and they weren't getting text messages while they're sitting on the airplane, and you could actually get a lot of reading done. So I always carried an important book around with me to read. Can you imagine the looks I got when I carried Dirt, Greed, and Sex around with me? Little did people know that I was actually reading a book about how to interpret the Bible. Now, the dirt in this title has to do with what is clean and what is dirty. In other words, purity rules. All cultures have purity rules, and cultures distinguish themselves from those around them, at least in part by what is acceptable to eat and whom you can or cannot touch. Even we in the United States have purity rules. I realize that it sometimes seems that anything goes in this culture. But in fact, we do have rules, though some of them may be implicit rather than explicit. Think of parents telling their little one, "Don't eat that, it's dirty." In the United States, we don't eat dogs, though in some cultures, people do. In other cultures, they will not eat cows, whereas many of us do eat beef. Call a snail escargot and cover it with enough garlic butter, and some of us will eat it happily while others recoil at the idea, though such creepy crawlies may indeed be the salvation of future generations of humans as other food supplies dwindle. Ancient Israel distinguished itself from surrounding cultures by its purity laws, including laws about food. Some foods were prohibited, pork, for example. We are going to participate in the gathering of food and toiletry items for the UC Davis drive that is going to start this next week. Please bring your items within the next 2 weeks. I forgot to announce this earlier, but we have only 2 weeks to accomplish this because then the items have to be picked up. Please do not bring pork items. That was one of the requests. So bring your non-perishable foods, but do not bring pork. Some cultures will not eat pork. I have a really good friend who is an Orthodox Jew, and she still adheres to the purity practices such as avoiding pork and preparing her foods in certain ways before eating them. Walter Brueggemann, who is my favorite scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures, argues that these kinds of rules are a God-given strategy for survival when you are a small community surrounded by larger dominant communities and you are at risk. Keeping yourself separate, making clear what it requires to be a member of the group, these things can be very important for surviving. By Jesus' day, not only did some adhere to these purity rules, but different groups tried to distinguish themselves by having even more strict purity rules, a kind of holier-than-thou approach to life. You know, you don't eat this, but we also don't eat that. But Jesus turned everything upside down when he said, this is from Matthew 15, "What makes you unclean is not what goes into you, but what comes out of you." In other words, all those food requirements are not crucial for sustaining your relationship with God. What matters is what is in your heart and mind and the words that come out of your mouth. Paul echoes this in the passage that Leslie read for us today. Granted, Paul is a little more muddled about it. His first point is simply this: we know that there's only one God, therefore there are no idols, therefore there is no need to eat or to avoid eating food that has been sacrificed to idols. Food, as Paul puts it, does not bring us near to God. You are no worse if we do not eat and no better if we do. Food is simply irrelevant to your relationship to God. And that means, importantly, that those who follow Jesus are free. We are free from rules and regulations about what we can and cannot eat, and whether the meat we purchase must be prepared in a particular way. Following purity practices is not what brings you closer to God. Whether that's true of sexual purity practices is another topic for another sermon for another day. The point is, you are free, and this is good news. But, isn't there always a but in human life? Don't you wish that sometimes there wasn't that but that has to follow on the good news? For Paul, there is a caveat. There are those around you who may not be as firmly rooted in their faith and their relationship to God as you are, and for their sake, you might want sometimes to follow purity practices, or at least not to flaunt your disregard for those practices so that you do not lead others astray. For Paul, we are free, yes, but we are free precisely to serve others, and therefore freedom has its limits. We must walk a kind of tightrope, knowing that we are no longer bound by the law or the customs of the day. We can eat and drink anything we want, and yet we must always be mindful of whether we are setting an example that could cause others to stumble or sin, for that would be very bad. If you lead others astray, if you become a stumbling block to them, you are sinning against God and against Christ. Paul's caveat made me think of that wonderful country western song by Rodney Atkins. Some of you will know it. A father is driving the car with his little boy buckled into his booster seat and a Happy Meal on a tray in front of him. The stoplight changes suddenly, the father slams on the brakes to avoid an accident, and the Happy Meal goes flying. Then the 4-year-old says a 4-letter word that begins with the letter S. "Son, where did you learn to talk like that?" the father asks. And the boy answers, "I've been watching you, Dad, ain't that cool? I'm your buckaroo, I want to be like you." Uh-oh. The father realizes that he has been setting a very bad example for his little boy. We set examples not just for children, but for other adults as well. Take care, says Paul, that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block for others. And in the following chapter in 1 Corinthians, Paul will declare that he becomes all things to all people. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. To the weak, I became weak. I became all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. So this is the basic paradox for Christians. Our very freedom becomes our binding. Precisely because we are in relationship with God, without all those strings attached, we are not bound. We are bound not by strings made of rules and regulations, but by love. Our very freedom requires us to pay attention to the needs of those around us and to avoid doing things that could weaken their faith or their relationship to God. As the haunting song that we just sang, made so popular by Josh Groban, he did not write it, by the way, as that haunting song puts it, you raise me up. We are called to raise others up rather than to block or impede another's path to God. So we walk a tightrope between freedom and service. But how do we do this? If Paul is right, it is love that gives us the wisdom to know how to do that walk. In a moment, we are going to sing Jesu, Jesu. Fill us with your love. Teach us how to serve the neighbors we have in you. A recent event here at Parkside is, for me, a shining example of how to serve. Those who have been here for any length of time know that we always try to have a pride banner hanging outside our church. That banner is an important statement of who we are. It has been torn down many times, and we replace it over and over. Recently, it was torn down again, and this time the perpetrator was captured on video. Worse yet for him, his friend who was waiting in the car kept yelling at him, "Hurry up, Zach, hurry up." So we not only have a picture of the perpetrator, we have a name as well. With that information, the leadership of Parkside could have gone to the police and sought to have this young man arrested for vandalism. Instead, our leaders chose to write a public letter to Zach, inviting him to come and talk to us, promising him that he would be welcome here. I am ever so grateful to our leaders who took that risk and issued that invitation. Calling the police might have pushed him further away from God, and we might have become a stumbling block for him. I was not part of the decision team that chose the creative response to Zach. I'm not sure, quite frankly, that I would have been as creative or as magnanimous in response to his vandalism as were the leaders who took that action. I'm humbled by their decision. Offering community and possible friendship is the way to new beginnings, both for Zach and for us. Several weeks ago, Margie Miller asked us to listen. Listen to the voice of God, whether it comes in the crashing roar of a hurricane or the still small voice that we hear only in silence, whether it comes as we sit quietly with folded hands in church or as we hike with energy in the mountains, sing with gusto in the shower, walk quietly around a labyrinth, or inhale the wonderful fragrance of wood shavings in a carpenter's shop. In that listening, may we find the love of God that gives us wisdom and permits us to walk a faith-filled tightrope. The first time I typed that, it came out right rope. Sometimes our mistakes have a lot to teach us. May we walk a faith-filled tightrope, balancing precariously between the heavens above and the abyss below, and hoping to get safely to the other side without becoming a stumbling block for others. Amen.